I pretended to be homeless for a month to see which friends would actually help me. Last year, I was going through this weird phase where I kept questioning everything about my relationships and friendships. My mom had just passed away from cancer, and I was dealing with all these complicated feelings about who actually cared about me versus who just pretended to care. The funeral was this massive wake up call because I saw how some people I thought were close friends barely showed up, while others I barely knew brought casseroles and stayed to help clean up. I started having these intrusive thoughts about whether people would actually be there for me if I really needed them. Like, really, truly needed them, not just needed someone to vent to over coffee or borrow $20 from. I became obsessed with this idea that most of my friendships were just surface level and built on convenience rather than genuine care. My apartment lease was ending anyway, and I had been thinking about moving somewhere cheaper to save money. I had about $15,000 saved up from my mom's life insurance payout, so I wasn't actually broke, but I started formulating this crazy plan. What if I pretended to be homeless for a month and reached out to different friends to see who would actually help me? I know it sounds absolutely insane now, but at the time, it felt like the only way to get real answers about who my true friends were. I was in this dark headspace where I felt like I couldn't trust anyone's motivations, and I needed concrete proof of people's character. The grief was making me paranoid and suspicious of everyone around me. I moved my stuff into a storage unit and told my landlord I was moving out early. I bought a cheap sleeping bag and some raggedy clothes from thrift stores. I even practiced looking disheveled in the mirror, which feels so cringy thinking about it now. I created this whole backstory about how I lost my housing due to unexpected medical bills and was sleeping in my car until I could get back on my feet. The first person I reached out to was my college roommate, who I had stayed close with over the years. We texted regularly, and she always talked about how I was like a sister to her. I sent her a carefully crafted message, explaining my situation and asking if I could maybe crash on her couch for a few nights while I figured things out. Her response was so cold and dismissive it actually shocked me. She said she was really sorry about my situation, but she had a lot going on with work, and her boyfriend was staying over most nights, so it wouldn't be convenient. She suggested I look into local shelters and offered to send me some links to resources. No offer to help financially, no invitation to even come over for dinner, just a polite brush-off with some generic advice. I was devastated, but also weirdly vindicated, because it confirmed my suspicions about fake friends. I decided to keep going with the experiment because I needed to know who else would fail this test. My high school best friend was next on the list, someone I had been friends with for over 15 years and who had always claimed I was her closest friend. Her response was even worse than the first one. She read my message and didn't even respond for 3 days. When she finally texted back, she said she was dealing with her own financial struggles and couldn't really help right now, but she hoped I figured everything out soon. She never even asked for more details about what happened or how I was doing emotionally. I started keeping a list of everyone's responses in a notebook, rating them on a scale of 1 to 10 for helpfulness and compassion. Most people were falling into the 2 to 4 range, offering sympathy but no actual assistance. I was starting to feel really bitter and cynical about human nature in general. Then I reached out to this woman I had met at a book club about 6 months earlier. We had only hung out maybe 5 or 6 times, and I wouldn't have even considered her a close friend, more like a friendly acquaintance. I almost didn't include her in the experiment because I figured if my close friends wouldn't help, why would someone I barely knew? But I decided to test her anyway, partly because I was curious and partly because I was running out of people to contact. I sent her the same basic message about losing my housing and needing a place to stay temporarily. Her response came back within an hour and completely blew me away. She immediately called me instead of texting and said she had a spare bedroom that I could use for as long as I needed. She didn't ask a lot of questions about my situation or make me feel like I had to justify why I needed help. She just said she had been in tough spots before and knew how scary it could be to not have stable housing. This response was so different from everyone else's that I actually started crying on the phone with her. She offered to come pick me up right away and said she would help me look for more permanent housing options. She even offered to lend me money if I needed it for deposits or application fees. I was so overwhelmed by her kindness that I almost confessed the whole thing right there on the phone. But I had committed to doing this experiment for a full month, and I wanted to see it through. I told her I needed a day to get my things together and would come by the next evening. I spent that night in my car in a parking lot, which was actually the first time I had really slept rough during this whole experiment. Up until then, I had been staying in cheap motels and just telling people I was homeless. But I wanted to have the authentic experience of what it felt like to not have a safe place to sleep. It was terrifying and uncomfortable, and made me realize how privileged I was to have always had stable housing. I kept jumping at every little noise, and I was freezing cold even with the sleeping bag. I barely slept and kept thinking about people who had to do this every night with no end in sight. The next day I went to her house, and she welcomed me like I was a long-lost family member. She had prepared the spare room with fresh sheets and towels, and she had stocked the fridge with my favorite foods that she remembered me mentioning at book club. She gave me a key to the house and told me to make myself at home. Over the next week, she continued to amaze me with her generosity. She never made me feel like a burden or like I was imposing on her space. She invited me to join her for meals and movie nights, and she genuinely seemed to enjoy having me around. She helped me look at apartment listings online and offered to be a reference for me with landlords. Meanwhile, I was still testing other friends and getting mostly disappointing responses. My yoga class friends, my work acquaintances, even some family members were all giving me the polite but unhelpful treatment. A few people offered to take me out to dinner or buy me groceries, which was nice, but not the level of support I was looking for. I started feeling really guilty about deceiving this woman who was being so kind to me. She would ask gentle questions about my situation, and I would have to make up more lies to keep the story consistent. I was getting deeper and deeper into this deception, and it was eating away at me. After about 2 weeks, something happened that changed everything. I was using her computer to look at apartments when I accidentally saw her bank account information on a tab she had left open. She had less than $800 in her checking account and several overdraft fees from recent transactions. I realized that this woman who had been so generous with me was actually struggling financially herself. She had been buying extra groceries and paying for gas for me to get to job interviews, all while barely having enough money for her own expenses. She had been giving me money she didn't really have to spare. This discovery completely shattered me. Here I was, sitting on $15,000 in savings, letting someone who was genuinely struggling support me based on a lie. I felt like the worst person in the world, and I knew I had to come clean immediately. I waited until she got home from work that evening, and I told her I needed to talk to her about something important. I confessed the entire experiment, from the beginning motivation to the detailed list I had been keeping of everyone's responses. I told her about my savings account and how I had been lying about my financial situation. I expected her to be furious and kick me out immediately. I was prepared for her to yell at me and call me manipulative and selfish. Instead, she was quiet for a long time, and then she started laughing. Not mean laughter, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of the whole situation. She said she had actually suspected something was off because my story didn't quite add up, and I seemed too put together for someone who had recently become homeless. She said she had been curious about what I was really doing, but decided to help me anyway because she figured I must need something, even if it wasn't housing. Her response made me cry harder than I had since my mom's funeral. She was so understanding and forgiving about the whole thing, which made me feel even worse about deceiving her. She said she was glad I had told her the truth, and that she understood I was grieving and trying to make sense of my relationships. I offered to pay her back for everything she had spent on me, plus extra for the emotional manipulation. She refused to take any money, and said the experience had been worth it because she had enjoyed having a housemate, and felt like we had become real friends through the process. This plot twist completely changed how I viewed the entire experiment. I realized that the most genuine friendship I had found wasn't with someone who passed some arbitrary test, but with someone who showed unconditional kindness, even when she suspected I wasn't being completely honest. I ended up staying with her for the remainder of the month, but now as a real friend rather than someone running an experiment. I helped her with her own financial struggles and we became incredibly close. We're still best friends now, over a year later, and I consider her family. The experiment taught me that friendship isn't about who will help you in crisis situations, but about who will show up with genuine care and compassion, regardless of the circumstances. It also taught me that testing people's loyalty through deception is a terrible way to build meaningful relationships. I never contacted most of the people who had failed my test to tell them what I had done. I realized that their responses, while disappointing, weren't necessarily indicative of their character or the value of our friendships. People have different boundaries and comfort levels with helping others, and that doesn't make them bad people. Some of the friends who hadn't offered housing assistance reached out to me later to check on how I was doing and offer other forms of support. I realized I had been measuring friendship by a very narrow standard and missing the ways people actually showed they cared about me. The whole experience helped me process my grief in an unexpected way. I had been so focused on testing whether people would be there for me that I had forgotten to be there for myself. The kindness of one near stranger reminded me that there are genuinely good people in the world who will help others without expecting anything in return. I also learned that my trust issues were rooted in my own insecurities and fear of abandonment, rather than any actual evidence that people didn't care about me. The experiment had been a way to avoid dealing with my grief and the vulnerability that comes with relying on others for emotional support. Looking back, I'm embarrassed by how elaborate and manipulative the whole thing was. I put people in impossible situations and judged them for responses that were actually quite reasonable. I wasted a month of my life trying to prove something that wasn't worth proving in the first place. But I'm also grateful for the experience because it led me to one of the most important friendships of my life. Without that experiment, I never would have reached out to someone I barely knew, and I never would have discovered what real generosity and compassion look like. The woman who helped me taught me that true friendship isn't about what people will do for you, but about how they make you feel when you're with them. She made me feel valued and cared for during one of the darkest periods of my life, and that meant more than any housing assistance ever could have. I still have the notebook where I kept track of everyone's responses, and sometimes I flip through it as a reminder of how skewed my perspective had become. I see now that I was asking people to solve a problem that wasn't really a problem, and judging them for being unable to read my mind about what I actually needed. The real lesson wasn't about who my true friends were, but about how grief can make you do irrational things in search of certainty and control. I had been so afraid of being disappointed by people that I created a situation designed to disappoint me, which is pretty messed up when you think about it. I ended up moving into an apartment near my new best friend, and we spend time together almost every day. She never brings up the experiment or makes me feel bad about the deception, but I think about it often and try to be more honest and straightforward in all my relationships now. The experience changed how I approach friendships and how I offer help to others. I try to be more generous with my time and resources, and I don't keep score of who does what for whom. I learned that keeping track of people's responses to your needs is a sure way to poison any relationship. Most importantly, I learned that the best way to find good friends is to be a good friend yourself, not to test people's loyalty through elaborate schemes. Real friendship is built on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine care for each other's well-being. I never did find out who my true friends were through that experiment, but I did find out what true friendship actually looks like. And that turned out to be much more valuable than any test results could have been.